let's take a step back and talk about what are we trying to achieve? What is our objective? Because I think sometimes we think, okay, every objective is like going to be absorbed by physicians the same way. You can do it with really little and you can do it with a lot. And ultimately, the goal is this: you develop a streamlined communication strategy that's impactful, but then measurable, because we got to the reach that we were hoping for. And we got to an understanding through the QR code at the end and the survey at the end that, in fact, our audience is not in the audience.
Welcome to Transforming Medical Communications, a podcast by MedComms experts. We share medical communications insights and advice from the best and brightest in the industry to find out what they're doing to push our industry forward. Here's your host, Wesley Portegies.
Welcome to Transforming Medical Communications, the podcast where we explore bold ideas shaping the future of medical affairs. Today, we're joined by Georgea Pasedis. Georgea previously held the position of Senior Vice President and Global Head of Medical Affairs at Dompé, which is a biopharmaceutical company focused on developing innovative therapies for rare diseases. Georgea is an expert in building medical affairs teams from scratch, and especially in the rare disease space. And in this episode, we're going to dive into Georgia's journey of developing a medical communications function with limited resources, emphasizing the importance of truly listening to HCPs, and how to build effective strategies that resonate with healthcare professionals. Georgea, it's great to have you here. Welcome to the show.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. So to open up here, Georgea, as someone who's really deeply passionate about building teams from the ground up, could you shed some light on one of the earliest lessons you've learned about shaping medical communication strategies?
Absolutely. And I think it probably started even subconsciously as early as being a pharmacist. Much of your career is spent explaining things or partnering with physicians and trying to make sure that you're on the same page for the patients. So I think it probably started even before, I really was a medical communications professional or led those teams in a way where, you clinically are getting all this really complex information and dwindling it down to a really one valid point that you're trying to get across. So probably started early in my pharmacy career, but then really, for me, a lot of it started when, the transition in how physicians take in information, to me, over the last 10 years has really changed. They're busier than ever. They're like the rest of us, where we're all human and we're consuming 10 to 12 hours a day of information on our phones, on the TV, through work. So for me, a lot of it was, how do I get my point across in a really quick, valid way that's scientific in nature? So a lot of it really started with just simplifying my approach. How do I think about things and how would I want to consume information? And a lot of it from there, I think, became kind of natural to how I would build teams. So I would hire individuals with that same mindset of streamlining information, really, dwindling down concepts that are complex to the one or two most important aspects. And really from there, I think everything starts becoming part of, this medical communication strategy that to me is streamlined, effective, and most importantly, impactful.
I like how you called out the information intake has changed so much over the last, decades or maybe 5 years, right? It seems to just be progressively changing. And it's funny because I have a lot of conversations about that too. And what I'm often trying to explain is, like, if we look at our own personal lives, going to Instagram, TikTok, YouTube Shorts, somehow we all understand that. But then in scientific communications, we still kind of, stick a little bit to what we learned, how we learn to communicate in academia, right? But people don't compartmentalize how they consume content between their personal and professional life. So when you are used to that in your personal life as a physician, you're obviously also going to have those same preferences in your professional life. And so I really like how you outlined that. And I think it's really important we keep pushing the boundaries on that. And of course, there's definitely a lot of progress, but there's also still a lot of work to be done to get there, in my opinion. So maybe talking a little bit more about those needs of HCPs in medical communication. So what are some key indicators that would have worked for you in aligning your strategies with HCP needs?
Yeah, and for me, a lot of it was taking a step back and building a new foundation, no matter at what point I stepped into an organization. So whether we were already, 5 years into the life cycle of a product and a disease, or we were starting from scratch, for me, it was always take a step back and actually figure out what is your objective that you're trying to achieve. Because then to me, your strategy changed a little bit, or maybe even just the tactical elements changed, but your strategic objectives may have stayed the same. So for me, it was always let's take a step back and talk about what are we trying to achieve? What is our objective? And then from there, pick your audience. Because I think sometimes we think, okay, every objective is like going to be absorbed by physicians the same way. So when you're talking about diagnosis, let's just use that as an example, which is a big, medical communication strategy for everybody, increased diagnosis or improved diagnosis. If you're talking about improved diagnosis with KOLs, that looks very different strategically than what it would look like for community HCPs, not only because of the environment that they're in, but also the level of knowledge that they already have. So for me, it was really let's take a step back. What's the objective we're trying to achieve? Who are we going to deliver that objective to? And then ultimately, then you can really determine, okay, from that strategically, what does that look like from an executional perspective? And it shouldn't be the same for every target audience, and it shouldn't be the same for every strategy. It really should be based on need and not precedent. Because I think to your point, you said it earlier, we kind of all just do the same things from a medical communication strategy perspective. We publish papers, we host medical educational, symposiums, but there's just so much more that you can do that's way more impactful for physicians. I think you mentioned it, like you could do podcasts, you could do short clips, you could do videos, and you have to really do those effectively or they'll fall flat again, to your point, because we're just in a society where consuming information has just become so overwhelming. So improving diagnosis shouldn't be a 65-page presentation by an MSL. You can do that for sure, but there are definitely different, approaches to the way, each HCP needs to consume information. And so for me, it was always take it back to the foundation of what are you ultimately trying to achieve and what's the simplest way to get there versus just doing and deploying the same tactics we always have holistically.
Yeah, absolutely. I always like to think that there's like two different elements to it, right? One is reach and the other one is engagement. And to me, that means like, first of all, do we have access to them in one or the other way? Where is the audience consuming information so we can be there? And the engagement is more like, okay, what we're now communicating, is it actually relevant to them? Do they resonate with the content? And especially on that topic, I like to use the phrase, one size fits no one really well, right?
You're right.
And
Right.
that's kind of where we often are. But I don't think that's because of a lack of appetite for tailoring messages. But a question I'm often getting is like, okay, yeah, sounds great in theory, Wesley. Of course, we need to know exactly what our audiences are and what their needs are. But like, A, how do we really know that? And B, how do we then distribute these different content types or maybe not content types, but different messages, so to say, to those audiences specifically? So I was wondering to your view on that.
Yeah, I think to your point, maybe not every organization has access to all the data needed to make these super informed decisions, but the more data you can have, the better informed you can be, to your point. And I think, when we started off at Dompé, we didn't have all those resources. We didn't have all the data and analytics and EHR data. Of course, as we became more successful, we were able to purchase all of that data. But we really just started off using the data we had from the field. So what the sales reps were saying, what the MSLs were saying, and really what we were learning from a MedCom's perspective from our advisory boards, asking the right questions, trying to learn from the physicians on what they needed. So ultimately, we grew and became more sophisticated, and then we're able to purchase EHR data, looking at trends, looking at buying data from conferences to see what are physicians attending, what are they actually engaging with. So yes, I think you can start off with what the in tune of what's happening in the field from the basic elements of what you already have, and then it can become a much more sophisticated process, especially when you start talking about big budgets and big investments in medcoms. You really want to know what that ROI is. So you want to start with good data on why we should be there, who are we talking to when we're there, and what is the ultimate measurable goal? Is it that later those physicians become more well-informed, or is it that they actually change clinical behavior? And so, I think you can do it with really little and you can do it with a lot. And ultimately, the goal is the same for me, is that you develop a streamlined communication strategy that's impactful, but then measurable. And you can do that at a variety of scales. And I use conferences as a perfect example. And I'll end on this one is because conferences have become the most overwhelming medical communications events of all time. There are medical symposiums going on. There are posters and abstracts being presented. There are sales teams doing, speaker bureaus and sympos. There are the promotional floors. And ultimately, I just feel like, how can you break through the noise? And I think that's what you have to ask yourself every time you set up your strategy is, how am I going to break through the noise? And am I going to get to my ultimate goal, whatever that goal may be, changing clinical practice or improving diagnosis, or maybe just getting to doctors. Maybe your goal is just reach in general. You just want to get your message out there and make people more aware. So ultimately for me, I'm always talking to the team about, let's take it back to what are we trying to achieve and how are we going to break through the noise? Because there's just so much noise in our environment now.
Yeah, absolutely. And another thing related to that would be reaching the majority of the physicians, right? So if you think about it, field medical is visiting typically the KOLs or KEs, whatever term is being used by the different companies, right? So kind of top tier. And then the people visiting the conferences are typically that same group, right? But then like a lot of the physicians, diagnosing and prescribing for these particular diseases are like community physicians that can't be at the conference, that do not get MSL visits, and how do we reach them, right? So I'm wondering, and then especially in kind of from what I understood, like an initially bootstrapped model that you worked in, how did you go about engaging that group, that type of audience?
That is exactly what we thought to ourselves as well. Because if our ultimate goal was at that point, we were treating a rare disease and nobody was diagnosing the disease because people weren't even aware of what it looked like and what I was really looking for, except for our top experts, our KOLs. So really, we worked with our KOLs to get to a point where we could dwindle it down enough where a community HCP could really comprehend how I could find this patient, so I don't wait till they get so severe that I am already referring them to one of the top KOLs or the top cornea specialists. So for us, we started with a strategy, to your point, that was hyper-focused on, if our goal was to improve diagnosis, we don't need to tell the top KOLs how to improve diagnosis. We need to tell the community HCPs how to do that. So we did start with the KOLs, we got their feedback, and then we got back with a group of community HCPs and says, does this resonate with you? Would you give an MSL time for this? If you wouldn't give an MSL time for this, would you listen to a podcast about this? Would you go to a CME about this? Would you go to a medical symposium? Where do you consume information and how do we get to you? And we really did end up creating a target list that was 3 parts, which I know people might think that's a little complex in the beginning, but when you have really limited resources and you don't have all the data yet, we had like our part 1 community HCPs. They only wanted to consume content through like MSL education in the office. So they didn't want the MSLs taking them out to an event. They didn't want to meet them at the conferences. They wanted to do like a lunch and learn in the office. So that was like our part 1 group. So we segmented them out, gave the MSLs very specific tailored content for them. And ultimately the goal was the same, improve diagnosis. So then we would go back, 3 months later and talk to the same group of physicians to say, okay, how is diagnosis going? Have you been able to find patients in the practice that look like this? And it was all based through case-based learning, right? So this is what you're looking for, as opposed to, here's the disease. This is what's great about it. This is what you should look for. It was, here's exactly what these patients look like. How can I help you, find these patients, but how can I also help you diagnose them appropriately? And then also teaching diagnostic techniques. So that was our part 1 group really didn't know how to use some of the diagnostic tools. So we actually, as an MSL team, trained our team how to use the diagnostic tools, brought the tools into the office, and actually trained them on how to use the tools, and their technicians too. So really, we really took a kind of bootstrap, like low budget, like get as much, out as it as you can. And we did as many of those for our part 1 group as we could. Our part 2 group said, I only go to conferences. I don't want anybody coming to the office. I need to consume it at one of these big conferences, either through a poster or through a medical sympo. So again, we just really listened and learned. And then eventually we got better data and were able to come up with more clear-cut, streamlined tactics. But we really just took the audience and we started breaking down tactics as organically as you could imagine, right? Just based on exactly what the physicians asked us.
Yeah, that's great. I'm wondering about something practical here. And sorry if this was already obvious, perhaps, but how did you ask these people exactly what their preference was? Is this like, because I kind of assumed that there was maybe like an ad board and you asked a representative of those groups, but now I'm almost understanding that you categorize these people in one or the other way, maybe through a survey or something like that. Just trying to understand that a little bit better.
Yeah, exactly. So we did categorize everybody into groups based on their diagnosis, whether we knew it through the field teams or we knew it through EHR data. And again, high level EHR data. We weren't able to purchase like big amounts of data that we would have loved to have, but we were still early in our launch. And to your point, we didn't broadly just listen to, okay, we talked to 10 KOLs at an advisory board and they said this. We actually then, to your point, we tested it. We surveyed physicians, we looked at their EHR data, and then applied the feedback that we got from the KOLs and said, okay, does it really make sense? Is this broad stroke really reasonable? So we did do a lot more research before we launched our tactics to make sure that they were tailored, and fit for purpose.
Yeah, that's amazing. So that means like initially you invest budget and effort into really understanding where you can reach your audience. So then later on, when you start, will need to invest more in developing all your materials and developing your channels, you're actually more effective and get likely a better, I know it's medical affairs, but return on investment, so to say.
Yeah, just return on education, right? Whatever your heart desires to call it is your overall spend, cost per learner. But even it was as down to like when we didn't have I went out and asked the doctors myself, right? I think as a leadership team member, you think, okay, I'm leading the department. My job is to just build the strategy and hope that the team, executes on it. But I was in the field for the first 6 months, learning from the physicians myself, listening, making sure I really understood before we deployed a strategy. Because I think a lot of the companies we just deploy with a little bit of basic information up front. But I think when you don't have a ton of resources and you can only really try one time, you really want to get that one time right, especially, if it's like your big launch. So we, even down to me, like I was out in the field every week talking to physicians, trying to learn more. Like, I saw that a few of your colleagues surveyed this way. Do you view it that way? Is that how you diagnose patients? Do you have these tools in your office? So really getting down to the nitty gritty in the beginning. And then of course it evolves from there, right? Once you launch and you get more money and you're able to have more sophisticated internal insights and data, you don't need to have every person in the field asking those questions. But I was out there doing it myself.
Is MedComms evolving faster than your team can keep up? You're not alone, and you don't have to navigate it alone. Wesley Portegies, host of Transforming Medical Communications, is offering a limited number of free 30-minute consultancy sessions for medical affairs professionals. Whether it's medical communications, field medical, or medical affairs training, these sessions provide an opportunity to address your real-world challenges, pressure test ideas, and walk away with practical strategic insight for your team. No fluff, just strategy. Follow the on-screen link or in the show notes to book your free session now.
That's amazing. I'm a huge proponent of doing that. And I worked in the industry in a previous life, and I would do exactly the same. I was on the commercial side, so slightly different. But still, like I had data, but I also kind of wanted to validate the data. And I think there's just no better alternative than actually being out there yourself, because you hear more than the data. The data starts getting color to it. You start understanding the context behind it and why this is so. If you hear it like directly from your audience. And actually, this is the second time I hear this in the last few episodes. And it's something I really applaud. And I think there's so many people in our industry that haven't had the opportunity really to be in the field. And I think like co-visits and these kind of things are very important for our industry, because it just helps us forming like a better picture of what the needs really are beyond the data. And that will help us apply it better as well. So really cool to hear that. So you really followed this kind of needs-based strategy. Was there anything in terms of the preferences or channels that like stood out to you that was kind of a surprise, like something you didn't expect to come out of those surveys or those questions?
I think it's surprised, but not surprised because, you're hearing these trends, but you couldn't validate some of these trends because you hear about them and you're like, is that real or not real? So physicians consuming, information at these kind of dinner programs or speaker bureau type programs, a lot of the surveying was telling us that they attend them, but not the best way for them to change clinical practice, right? So they enjoy going to them. They enjoy the peer-to-peer interaction. They enjoy hearing from their peers, but they don't feel they leave with a change in the way that they operate from a clinical perspective. Do they look for, picking that product more than another because they went to it? No, not really. But when we were listening to some of the other survey data, they said, well, if I hear it in a CME program or a program where it's an accredited program from a peer, it holds a different weight. I would then actually go back from a clinical perspective and actually look for those things and try to implement those types of products or those diagnostic techniques. So it's interesting how I think we deploy so much of our resources into the traditional things and then say, okay, CME and grants, if we had extra money, we'll maybe put a little bit there. But if you start really looking at these surveys and picking them apart, I mean that an N that's valuable, right? Not like 6 people. I'm talking about 6 to, not 6, I'm saying like 600, surveys where you're seeing a good trend. It would help maybe holistically companies make better investments versus medical trying to fight for a $1 million CME budget and commercial trying to get $1 million speaker bureau budget. If the leadership team looked at these surveys holistically, which is why I would share them in a broader sense, maybe you could make more informed research decisions at the executive level when budgets are being allocated. Because you always think to yourself, okay, speaker bureau is traditional, we should give $1 million to that. No, if we have leftover money, we might do CME. But if you look at some of these surveys, there was clear trends that peer-to-peer is the highest level of education for them. They intake the most. But actually, there's even tiers within peer-to-peer on how they impact and change their clinical practice.
Can you tell me more about that?
Yeah, so the speaker bureau was the perfect example. I was a marketer too. I led a marketing department. We invested $5 million at least in speaker bureau on an annual basis. Same thing at my recent organization. We know it's impactful. We know, but how impactful is it as opposed to other peer-to-peer education? Like, so for example, having a medical symposium where you might have a panel of physicians speaking about the same disease topic or the same diagnostic topic. So when we started diving into the data, we started tiering it. It almost became like a 3-tier system within peer-to-peer education. So almost like taking all of your peer-to-peer education, so how you approach doctors with other doctors, whether it's a speaker or a panel, and tiering it based on that survey data. Speaker bureau actually didn't end up holding the highest. The highest held was hearing from my peers at CMEs and COPE and CEU type programs. That would make me change my practice the highest level. Then the middle level was when I would attend what felt like a scientific, symposium or open house where my peers were telling me about something new and innovative, and then speaker bureau. So, even within the peer-to-peer umbrella, there are ways to use your resources more effectively if you only have a bucket of, money, even within just peer-to-peer being a little bit more strategic and effective.
Yeah, that makes total sense. Thank you for highlighting that. And I think we really need to take away from those learnings and optimize for it. And I think even when we have healthy budgets, right? Like, why wouldn't we aim for the highest efficacy we can create? Now, I know when you joined Dompé, it was kind of the medical affairs department there was like being built, right? It was in its infancy. So you built a team up there. What were some lessons that you learned along the way? And if someone else were to build like a strong medical affairs foundation from the ground up, what are things you would give them as advice?
Oh, wow. Yeah. I mean, I had the pleasure and privilege of building the organization from scratch at Dompé when I came on board. We didn't have any people, we didn't have any processes, and we definitely didn't have any systems or, data to go off of. It was really, luckily I had clinical expertise in the therapeutic area. And so that was kind of our starting place. But the lessons I think I learned, maybe the biggest lesson I learned is it's okay in a launch phase to take it a little bit slower to get to the most impactful outcome. It was the first time in my career that an organization let me do that because I came from organizations where it's go big, go fast, go now. We were definitely going fast, but thoughtfully fast. We always have the pharmacy joke of like start low, go slow so that, you don't overdose the patient or underdose the patient. And you can never go wrong with start low, go slow. And so I had the privilege of being able to be more thoughtful, be out in the field, listen to the physicians first before I started deploying traditional strategies. And also to trying to hire individuals who had that same mentality, right? That didn't just want to do your go big traditional tactics that, you typically do in pharma. So really hiring people with that same mentality, like listen first, then act second. So I did really have that privilege. I know not everybody gets that privilege. But the start low, go slow built a lot of success for us. Obviously, in the background, I had to build the whole infrastructure of the team. I had to build the policies, and I had to build really a team to execute all of the work. A lot of it too, we outsourced in the beginning. Don't be scared to outsource. I tell everyone, it's okay if your entire medical information team is outsourced, as long as you have access to all the data, you're in tune with what's happening. Don't be scared to outsource. I think we all think hire, build, build, build. It's much quicker to outsource. You can launch a lot faster, and you can really still get great talent outsourcing. So I wasn't scared to outsource in the beginning. We outsourced a lot of our medcoms functions. We outsourced to a lot of partners to build our, pubs teams, our medical writers, and we outsourced our medical information teams. So really don't be scared to outsource too. I think that's another big lesson that I learned early because hiring is time consuming and it's really hard to do in this environment. It's very competitive. You're interviewing, multiple candidates. It takes a long time. So another big lesson I learned is don't be scared to outsource. Don't be scared to start low and go slow. And don't be scared to get out in the field and listen. It might sound different than what you were hoping for. It might sound more hard to do it. But it also always leads to the best outcome and most impactful outcome when the physicians get what they ultimately have asked the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And, it sounds like by doing that, you can kind of follow the 80-20 rule, which probably, which means like you can maybe avoid the 20% that we traditionally do that really doesn't create a lot of effect. In addition to that, it sounds like not having any precedents helped you kind of building something anew and reconsidering what you really need and what is kind of optional, right?
Absolutely. I came from an environment where it was precedent, precedent, precedent. So I really struggled, but was so excited to have the silver platter to not have to do that because, especially, most organizations have some precedent already. Being a company that didn't have any precedent, I really got the chance to come in and also work with leaders that believed that that was the right way to do it, collaboratively, because I might believe that as a global medical leader, but if the global commercial leader didn't think that way and wanted to do everything based on precedent, everybody would have been clashing. So I was also very lucky that we all worked together to get that mindset. It's like, okay, let's take the best of all the precedent, okay, because the ones that worked really, really well, but let's not do all the other stuff that we kept as a joke of like, we don't have time or money for the fluff. And so we need the lean meat, only the lean components of the precedent that worked really well. So we kind of had this first board meeting, I remember, and it was, okay, what do you really feel passionate about from a precedent perspective? Like, what do you definitely want to do? And we kind of went around the table and everybody was allowed to bring like one thing from maybe their previous organization or what they previously had learned. They were allowed to bring one thing. And then from there, it was a whiteboard of all new ideas. What's going to be effective in this space? And everybody really got the chance to say, well, why? How would you do that differently? Why do you think it's going to be impactful? How are we going to measure that? And really helped each other and challenged each other in the beginning because we had a group of people that were willing to do that, which was obviously a big privilege and pleasure. But collaboration in medical communications and medical affairs is one of the key parts to our success at Dompé as well, too. We partnered with our commercial leaders, we partnered with our sales leaders, and we partnered with all of our compliance regulatory partners to a degree that looked very different than what most pharma companies do.
Yeah, absolutely. It looks like most of your colleagues agree with that statement because in our recent Medcom's Landscape survey, cross-functional collaboration came up as the biggest opportunity, but also the biggest hurdle that people in the industry are experiencing. But coming back to the bootstrap model and traditional approaches versus innovative approaches, I also hear a lot of people in the industry saying that they need to do more with less, right? Which makes sense because a lot of new opportunities opened up. If you look at even something simple like medical affairs being on social media or third-party platforms or generally digital approaches that were simply not really there in the past. So this all adds to budget spent, manpower needed in order to fuel all those initiatives. But then we're still doing all the traditional work too. What would you tell someone in an established company, but that is kind of experiencing this budget pressure and is kind of considering what to prioritize?
Yeah, I keep telling my team every year too the same thing. Everybody wants to do everything. They really do, especially when you start having the budgets to do so. I think if you're ever deploying more than three big strategic or tactical buckets at one time, you're probably doing too much. I just see that for any medical affairs department, you're probably doing too much. And because you can't do everything at 120% consistently across a department, if you're doing 12, 13, 14 things. So to your point, we tried the digital component and we have to learn fast, right? You can't deploy 1 year, campaigns and hope for the best. Like you need to be monitoring, tracking them on a monthly basis, looking at the data and give it enough time for it to vest 6 months, 8 months. But if you notice it's not working, you have to be dynamic and you have to switch quickly. So I guess my biggest piece of advice would be you really shouldn't be doing more than 3 things. If you are, you probably need to take a step back and actually say, are we going to do all of those things at 120%? And are they going to be 120% impactful for physicians? Or are you trying to do the model where it's like, this gets 30%, reach and attention and impact. This gets 50 and this gets 20, but collaboratively, connectively, these things get us to 100%. I don't think that that's a great model anymore. I think that's a very big pharma model, right? Where it's like deploy all these things and then eventually they'll all add up to 100%. I definitely believe you definitely need to disperse tactics. You need to touch physicians at a variety of places. They will never just learn from one thing. But you definitely don't want to try to touch them at 10 or 12 different places. I think 3 or 4 is usually the sweet spot, at least from my learnings.
Yeah, that makes sense. Could you share a concrete example with us of something that you did that you felt was affordable, but actually very, very impactful at the same time?
Affordable and very impactful. Sometimes those two things don't always go together, unfortunately.
I know. Sorry for putting you on the spot.
No,
But
I think
I was
it's
thinking
a great
about it
question.
because you seem to have experimented a lot. And I think that's where you come across these things like, oh, I didn't know this simple tactic was actually so effective. And it wasn't even hard or expensive, like either from a resource, like people resourcing perspective or from a budget perspective.
Yes. And I think, one concrete example was we had been debating MSLs doing podium presentations. And podium presentations was a thing. If you remember when MSLs first started, we were all doing podium presentations. It was like you and the physicians, and it was like you're the medical experts, they're medical experts, we're all on podium. It died out over the years. You didn't really see MSLs doing podium presentations anymore. Obviously, they shifted to more of your traditional tactics. One really inexpensive route that we took that we thought was really effective because we were trying to reach more physicians to get a better understanding of, are there more than what we're seeing in the data? And the way we would do that is we would survey them after the podium presentation. So the MSL would do the podium presentation. Again, they're already at the conference, so pretty inexpensive. We would usually be offered the podium spot, or we would purchase it through a very inexpensive sponsorship that maybe costs $1,000 or $2,000. And then we would deploy a really effective educational presentation about diagnostic technique or, the disease itself. It was very rarely about the product. It was more about what we were trying to achieve from a diagnosis perspective or a disease perspective. And to me, that was a really impactful, concrete example because we got to the reach that we were hoping for. And we got to an understanding through the QR code at the end and the survey at the end that, in fact, our audience is not in the audience. And so we learned that although it's very impactful presentation, it's getting to a completely different audience. Probably to your point earlier, they're not all going to conferences. And the people who are going to conferences were your residents, they were your fellows, they were your earlier educational audiences that we weren't actually targeting at all. So it actually helped us open the door to say, should we be talking to these people? Should we? They're very engaged. They really like the topic. They scored the topic very high from an interest perspective. So one example that I thought was really effective, gave us a lot of learnings, got us to our, end goal, was the podium presentations. And again, very inexpensive to do so.
Yeah, and I like how you said that like it gave you a new insight that you can then use for additional initiatives, right? So I think we're all like looking into metrics in medical affairs and medical communications, right? Like how can we measure how we're doing and how much impact we make? I think where we sometimes fall short a little bit is using that information as well to optimize our next actions, right? So sometimes we measure and it's like, well, it was maybe not that great, and then we just keep doing the same thing and concluding it's not that great instead of, or we see something that is great and we don't start doing more of that great thing. And I think there's so much opportunity for us to use these insights to decide on your communication strategy. It's a little bit like online advertising, right? Where they say like, well, if your return is good, then just do more of it, like
Right.
as much as you can, right? And I think the same is true in medical communications. If a certain strategy or tactic works really well, then we might need to shift away from some things that don't work as well and move more and allocate more to that particular tactic.
Yeah.
Um,
I don't know why medical communications feels like it's turning a barge. Like nobody really wants to, when you see something work really well, why does it feel so hard to turn the ship and get everybody to focus on it? To your point, if you have to really build a dynamic organization that is able to do that. Because if not, it's so easy to just fall into just keep doing what we're doing. Next year we'll do something different. But I was big on the metrics. I was big on every presentation. My biggest piece of advice is every presentation should have a QR code and a survey at the end. You should never get the chance to be in front of a physician without gaining something from them at the end of it, other than you're giving them something, right? You're educating them, but you should be getting something too. And whether that's you changing that presentation because it wasn't so great, but also gaining insight on what else is impactful to them so you can keep building a more dynamic strategy every time. And that's the way we learn. That's how every year our tactical plans, maybe sometimes even quarterly, our tactical plan shifted. A great example is the medical booths. We really were gung-ho that medical booths and booth talks were the way to go. And the data kept saying otherwise, but we kept wanting to do them. We're like, if we do it a little bit different. So we started surveying physicians after they would enter the booth. We'd ask them to scan the code after they listened to a booth talk. And the data was clear. It's like they don't really need this type of, they're hoping for some like coffee and a muffin, and they're hoping that they might get like something free, but they're not here to intake a 30-minute conversation with a medical professional. So it's definitely a lot of learnings from having those QR codes and surveys. And we got 90% completion of them. People think, oh, don't waste your time, doctors won't do them. It's not true. They really are willing to do them, and you gain a lot of information that helps you change your strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really like this example. I was laughing about. I was thinking about the compliant muffin. So I think we're used to ask questions when we're in the field, but we fall into the trap of always asking questions about the product and the science, and not so much about like how people actually prefer to communicate, right? So what I'm hearing from you is that you actually turned that around and started just asking questions more about that too. And I think that's extremely useful because indeed, like a lot of people are more than happy to communicate their preferences when it comes to communications. And that is then definitely something we can use and put into practice. So thank you for sharing that insight. That's amazing. I guess as a last question for you, if there is like one thing that you could change overnight. So let's say you have a magic wand and you could change a particular practice in medical communications or medical affairs for that matter, what would it be?
Ooh, I had the magic wand. What would I change? That's a great question. I feel like I always think about things I want to improve and things I want to change. Um, I, at a broader scale, I always wanted to change that medical affairs and medical communications were looked at as supportive functions, that they're not business critical functions. They're not business needle moving functions. And again, from a compliance perspective, we're always very cognizant of how we deploy that characteristic and, the description of all of that. But really, if I could change, one thing, it would be this is a business critical function for any organization to be successful. And Dompé is the perfect example. We deployed as many medical tactics and communication tactics as we did sales and commercial tactics. And we did that, strategically with really clear foresight on what we were hoping to achieve, not just to do things, but for me, if I could change one thing, it's getting marketing and medical communications to work together in partnership to say, well, why can the MSLs do that and the sales reps can't? Why can't we, why can't we do that? It's not why can't you and why can't we do this? It's how do we work together to help the organization, build a really successful model, knowing that your, aim is a little bit different, right? You want people to get to use the product at the end of it. We want people to be scientifically informed and help them make informed decisions for their patients. So if I could change one thing with a magic wand, it would be bringing those functions together more early on in launches. I had that privilege to do that at Dompé, which I think made us a very, very successful organization, and made us really push the boundaries on what medical can do, as opposed to maybe what traditionally they should be doing or, how they can support commercial. And really, to me, I think that brought us, from a company that nobody knew to a success story overnight, making over $1 billion in revenue annually. So I think if that would be my magic wand, that would probably be getting everybody to see that narrative earlier on.
Yeah, true that. Like there's so much synergy that is possible. And I actually do think that we're all moving in the right direction. I see it more and more, and I see a lot of silos that are connecting better. And I see more and more understanding also from the commercial side to how they can leverage medical affairs better and why medical affairs does need to have the seat at the strategy table. So, I think we're getting there, but I absolutely see your point. And I am fully aligned with that. Well, thank you for sharing that, and thank you for sharing all your other insights as well. I think this was very inspirational, and I'm hoping a lot of listeners can take away one or two things from this discussion that they can apply in their day-to-day approach. Georgea, thank you so much for your time and for being here, sharing your insights. It's really appreciated.
Oh, thank you so much. And like you said, I hope it inspires other MedComs leaders to really think outside the box and ultimately remember all of the work that we do supports the needs of patients, right? And if we keep that at the forefront of our minds, whether we're doing a medical communication strategy or field strategy, anything in medical, I think you have a good chance of being successful. So thank you again for the opportunity. It's always a pleasure to see you and a pleasure to have the conversation.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure.
Transforming Medical Communications is brought to you by MedComs Experts. To find out more about MedComs Experts and how we create some of the most cutting-edge medical communications programs anywhere in the world, visit www.medcoms-experts.com. And then make sure to search for Transforming Medical Communications in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. On behalf of the team here at MedComs Experts, thanks for listening.